Welcome to a Modern Nonprofit podcast, powered by the Charity CFO, your compass for creative solutions in running your nonprofit. I'm Tosha Anderson, your host and guide through this nonprofit maze. From fundraising to volunteer management, we've got your back. Join us each episode for fresh, game-changing strategies that can make a real impact. Hello, nonprofit friends. We're back for a very special episode today. Today is our 100th episode. It's really hard to believe that we've come this far on a podcast that was kind of accidental. For those of you that might be, tuning in for the first time, let me tell you a little bit about the story of this podcast. So I am a founder and managing partner of a nonprofit accounting service firm called the Charity CFO. And I found myself having conversations with so many nonprofit leaders over the years, struggling with a lot of similar issues. And then on the other side, I was oftentimes meeting consultants that were creating solutions to some of these problems. And I thought it would be a really cool way for me just to start recording these conversations and sharing them with the world in the hopes that maybe the nonprofit leaders struggling with some of these issues could be matched up with some of the resources that are becoming available, and we can just have all this information sharing. And so here we are 100 episodes later, and I think last time I checked, over 45,000 people have listened to this podcast. It's kind of wild because I tell people all the time, which is much like my life, this has all kind of happened accidentally, and here we are. So we're celebrating that. So who is this person I have on my show today? I have Aaron Landis. Aaron Landis is, like me, somebody that has once worked within the nonprofit sector himself and now works with the Charity CFO. And we're going to do a fun little episode on confessions from nonprofit leaders, validating some of the struggles, the setbacks, and survival stories of some of the people that we've come across. Now, not all of these are our clients. Maybe it didn't make sense, but Aaron, you are on the forefront every single day taking calls from nonprofit leaders that are struggling with some pretty significant things. And we've joked over the years that sometimes it feels a little bit like therapy for us sometimes to validate the struggles that we're not so different from them, or at least validating our experience like, yep, I've lived and learned those experiences myself when I worked within the industry. And people are pretty forthcoming with the things that they're struggling with because they're hoping that maybe in some small part we can be part of the solution. So we thought this would be a fun little episode to kind of share some of those stories to really paint a picture that you're not alone. And maybe there's some solutions out there that can help solve all of that. But Aaron, thank you for letting me drag you on this podcast. This is the first time Aaron's been on this podcast, but he's not new to the Charity CFO. He's not new to the nonprofit industry. And certainly many, many people have met Aaron. So Aaron, thank you for joining me this fine day.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be able to have this conversation. You and I have both, as you were a founder early on, having conversations with nonprofits. We've heard the good, the bad, the ugly. Mm-hmm. And, there's a lot of good out there, but there are also a lot of similar challenges, themes that are through line for nonprofits, even nonprofits who I would say have it figured out. Maybe they don't have everything figured out.
Yeah, exactly. So we get, we're always surprised, right? We're always surprised in the work, like, oh, I haven't seen that experience before. But there's a lot of overlap just kind of a theme of issues that we see a lot of nonprofits facing, especially now. But certainly even since I started working with this industry over 20 years ago. Now, just to put a little bit of context. So Aaron and I have a little bit of a different background, although we, like I said, have both worked in the nonprofit space. Aaron, actually, you worked in the fundraising space. You were on the fundraising team and raising money. And I was on the financial side, obviously serving in that capacity as a CFO of a nonprofit. So certainly some of these things ring true to us in our own experience when we worked for the industry, colleagues that we had when we worked within the industry. And now we're still hearing these things many, many years later, despite the fact that, many years have gone by since I started working in this space. And some of these themes still kind of ring true. So let's go ahead and start with obviously, because the Charity CFO is an accounting firm, we get a lot of calls for individuals that are really struggling with whatever kind of financial woes, whether it's their financial management, unreliable funding streams, budget cuts, something pretty extreme when it comes to just their finances in general. So Aaron, I know you have a lot of examples of this, but tell me an example of a pretty significant crisis that you've maybe fielded lately. Like what's an example?
I recently had a conversation where an organization who had grown significantly over the last 4 to 5 years. I mean, they went from 8 to 9 million a year in total revenue, and they were pushing about 20
Wow.
The majority of that growth was actually driven by one contract.
Mm-hmm.
And there was so much reliance on that revenue that the interim executive director, also, we can put a little pin in that, an interim executive director, turnover in leadership, was in the position and found out that that contract was not going to be renewed. And that cut
Oh,
their overall budget by about 50%. And so in this interim, suddenly the interim executive director is having to make massive budget cuts, make some tough
mm,
decisions, and figure out how can we contract our employment, our workforce, our programming, because the funding is not there. And so there are a lot of changes, a lot of things moving at one given time, and figure out, okay, not only do we have to contract that, but also what is the plan now to go after continued growth? This
mm-hmm.
organization, they were so reliant on this contract and other contracts, but they didn't have any grants. They didn't have any
Right.
additional like restricted funds. They had not even
Mm-hmm.
structured in a way that they could pivot quickly to go to that. Like they had not
Right.
had that experience in tracking that and reporting on it. And so part of this the interim executive director's strategy was to say, okay, well, we've got to make these tough decisions quick, and now we have to put together a plan for the next year.
Wow. I mean, to go from like overnight reducing your funding, and we're not, I mean, reducing funding by half is significant for anybody, right? I mean, that's going to put anybody in a crisis mode. But when you're talking 20 million to 10 million, substantially overnight, that is just, I don't know, that, wow. Yeah, that's hard to even digest, right? To think about how
Yeah.
you re-engineer everything. What do you do with your team? How do you keep people, in the programming and the people you're working with? And obviously these are services that are much needed within the community. Otherwise you wouldn't have grown that large. But to go, from 20 million to 10 million overnight because you lost a single funder is pretty substantial. And that kind of leads to a takeaway or kind of a lesson learned that we've experienced over the years, that we've seen so many different leaders struggling with this sort of thing. And we talk to people all the time about, we want to diversify our funding. We want to diversify our funding for risk management and mitigating against something like this happening. And the Charity CFO, we've worked with so many nonprofit organizations over so many years, and we've started kind of building a list, a library, if you will, of kind of best practices as it relates to kind of just leadership and financial management. And one of the things that we preach all the time is that we recommend that no more than 20% of your funding come from one specific source, right? And that you have to have some sort of structure for always thinking about diversifying your funding, whatever that might look like. To your point, Aaron, on this particular organization, you said they had no infrastructure for fundraising, because if you do a lot of earned revenue or programmatic grants or fee for service type grants, if you will, it takes a long time to build out a development team and develop those donor relationships. So if you're not having a way to solicit those sort of gifts or grants and then also manage a variety of different restricted grants, it's going to be really, really difficult to come out of that hole. So that's a tough one. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
And I know they're not alone. We hear things like this. I mean, that's definitely a pretty significant example there, but
And
and
that's,
then of
I mean,
course the
that's a
interim.
significant, yeah, yeah. And it's a significant, it's really a stark example of that. I mean, but even across the
Mhm.
board, we're talking about competition alone for dollars has increased. I think in 2022, the IRS report was estimated there are about 1.97 million total nonprofits.
Oh,
And
wow.
that's grown 5% every year since 2017.
Mm.
So at this point, you think about there's over 2 million, most likely.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
probably I think it's about one and a half of those are 501(c)(3)s. So there's a lot of
Mhm.
competition just to go after if you're trying to diversify. If an organization doesn't have individual donors or giving or any sort of development team to get that up
Mhm.
and running, is going to take a lot more time than 6 to 8 months. And we're talking probably years to establish a
Years.
donor base.
Absolutely years, years, years. Okay, what else do we have here? What are some of the other struggles that you're seeing right now?
Um, within within this, you know, board leadership struggles,
Mm.
leadership in general, common challenges with management. Now, my experience was more operational and development. I did not work as closely
Mm.
with boards, but I know that you have in your
Yes, I
time.
have. I've worked with boards. Um, for many years, right? When I was an auditor, I used to present to boards and I saw the differences of boards that were engaged and boards that showed up, boards that avoided the meetings with auditors at all costs, right? Which is probably more
Yeah.
often than not, but hey, I can't fault them for that. And then, I serve on boards now. And in my professional life here at the Charity CFO, like I also interact with many, many boards. And it's amazing to me the spectrum of boards and their level of involvement. And we can certainly talk about that, but there's also a level of like dysfunction, lack of focus, priorities, a disconnect between leadership and boards. There's all kinds of challenges. And this is probably, I don't know if I can pinpoint like the top thing I empathize most with leaders of nonprofits, but certainly the top of the list would be balancing your day-to-day work life, right? And leading an organization and balancing that with engaging with your board. And you must have two jobs. I mean, you have many jobs, but like you
Yeah.
have your whole job of being a CEO of an organization, but then you have your whole job of like essentially managing a board. And some could argue, well, the president of the board should be doing it. Yeah, but we know they don't. We know they don't like manage and run their own boards. The CEOs are really the ones that are facilitating the conversations and looking for board involvement and even soliciting new board members. Like they're doing so much of this work. And it's really, really tricky and something I really, really empathize because as if the main job, the CEO of the organization isn't enough, right? So where I've seen a pretty significant example of like board disconnect, I've worked with this organization. They're a fairly new organization that was seeded by really good intentions for like advocacy work and kind of lobbying at the state level. And they wanted to do some serious changes in the way that this particular programming operated. And the reality is they were seeded by a pretty significant donor that had kind of an agenda that was pretty much in alignment with the board initially, right? And so, and the leadership that was kind of formed with this organization. Well, like fast forward, a couple years, the leadership had shifted, right? We had moved essentially the executive director out of seat. The board, now that this was kind of up and running, seemingly became very disengaged. And they had kind of this interim executive director step in, and we started building a budget, right? And this person has kind of limited visibility into like what's happening with the organization. But where we started from, what are the existing contracts that we've committed to? Let's start there because we know we have to do that, right? And so we started there and we started building a budget. And basically we realized that the only money available for this organization was going to be, limited to fulfilling the contracts they've already committed to. So that seems pretty cut and dry, right? You take the budget, you start inputting all of the variables from these different contracts, and that's it. We send it over to the board, and they're like, what about this initiative? What about that initiative? What about this initiative? There's no money. There's no money for this. There's no money. There's no fundraising plan. There's like no funding opportunities out there. Like, and then by the way, there's the obvious disconnect that there's no like strategic plan. There's no framework for this interim executive director to even understand what the priorities are. So not only did we put this budget together and think we're going to get this task complete, but it really opened up this like big, Pandora's box of like, we don't even know what we want this organization to do at this point, because the initial thought of what we wanted them to do, they kind of made some progress on that within their first year or two, but then it's kind of like the what's next was never talked about. And then the executive director is just kind of like sitting there like, I don't know what to do. And then at the same time, because of that change in leadership and because within the organization management, I should say, I'm going to use that word management rather than leadership because some people might think board leadership. And then the board leadership had kind of become disengaged and kind of distracted with other things. There was no one really setting the direction or strategy for the organization. And that's a pretty significant example because I talked with the executive director. I said, look, I can't really help you build a budget. I hate to answer a question of like, what's the budget and how much money do we have with the question? I hate answering questions with questions, but it's really like, what does the board want to do? And if there's not a direction, it's really hard for the CEO or the executive director to execute on that direction and trickling that down to the program team, knowing what their priorities are, knowing the finance team, what the budget should look like, the fundraising element, what gaps do we have to fill? Like it all starts from the top. And when you lack that board leadership, it has that domino effect across the board. And really, to get things on the right track, we have to go back and start with that strategy and like get the board back and re-engaged and set the tone of where this organization is going to go. But that's not, again, this is not something that can start overnight. This is not like, okay, let's just like open up a Google Doc and, you know, knock this task
Right.
out. This takes a lot of thoughtful conversation at the board level and the management level. So that was a really tricky situation. But again, I know this is not unique. I mean, I know that so many organizations struggle with like disengaged boards. We don't have enough time to talk about all the other dysfunction with boards, like the overly engaged boards. I see you,
Right.
I
There's
hear
the
you,
other
leaders.
side. I haven't ever seen that. Well, I say this, the perfect board may exist. Rarely. It could be the unicorn board, but I see the extremes of over involved and into the weeds. Like you know, like we top down, but down to the point where I like trying to dictate some sort of like program management,
Mhm.
or completely, as we've talked about, like just checked out.
Checked out, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
Both are which impossible to kind of navigate. So I empathize.
Yeah.
And I don't have the perfect solution for that, you know, extremes on both sides of the spectrum, other than, like I said, some of this conversation today, for those of you listening, it really just validation. We hear you, we see you, we sympathize.
Yep.
We're normalizing this for you. If you're wondering, like, surely I can't be the only one. You're not the only one. Um, okay. Speaking of staff and speaking of challenges, let's talk about another really big theme that we experience, and this is around staffing challenges and operational challenges. Specifically, let's start with staffing shortages and burnout. This is, you know, a huge thing. I saw some statistics somewhere that said the nonprofit industry has the largest or the highest turnover in any other sector within the labor market. And I believe that based on what we see. And you might think of, you know, frontline, you know, programmatic staff, a lot of turnover. That's true, but also in leadership of nonprofits experiences high levels of burnout. I'm preaching to the choir here, I'm sure, but in a lot of turnover. And the impacts that has on an organization is pretty incredible. And a lot of the calls that we get are usually from individuals that are kind of frantic. I lost, usually for us, obviously, because we're you know, an accounting firm. You know, I lost my accountant. What do I do? But there are other leadership changes that will have kind of a ripple effect within organizations. Aaron's, what's a situation that you've maybe experienced lately?
Oh, well, there's leadership changes. There's during the, you know, filling a leadership position, maybe specifically
Mm,
like a CFO. Oftentimes, we'll talk to clients who have had long-term support and they've had
hmm
someone in that position, and when that turns over, you know, even for best intentions, going through a rigorous interview process,
Yeah.
that person coming in might not have the experience, and that's where we've
Mm,
seen a lot of challenges. Then that starts the ball rolling, and it's kind of the cycle of trying to find
hmm
the next person who's qualified, let alone to, you know,
hmm
to understand like what nonprofit accounting really is, and the beast,
Right.
the difference between your typical for profit. It's very different, and you don't have, I don't see a lot of CPAs just jump right in and say, okay, I'm going to hit this running. Like, it's a learning
hmm
process. We define
hmm
that, like we're always learning, right? We
Right.
see new things all the time that come up, that are challenges, that are unique to each individual organization that we support.
hmm
And that's how it works. It's just always the new thing, the new issue, the new problem that we want to solve.
hmm So I think there was an example recently, right, with an organization we started working with that
Yes,
had some
yeah,
turnover in leadership, and it wasn't even just the financial team, right?
yeah. There was a turnover, in specifically in the founder left.
hmm
The huge impact to operations. Fortunately, a
hmm
long-term staff person was able to step into the leadership role, but without that, I mean, the vacuum that it just ripple effect in terms of getting day-to-day things done was a real challenge,
hmm
especially around delivering program. It showed up in their
hmm
ability to actually bill funders. They went from being like
hmm
a financially sound organization to being almost out of business in less than 9 months because of the
Wow.
crunch on their cash flow. We talked about time it takes to make that up. It took them over 3 years to rebuild the full leadership that they needed.
Yeah. And I think I remember with that organization, they had several rounds of turnovers. So, you have a founder and, the RAC study, people are going to be there forever because, they have a lot invested into the success of the
Yeah.
organization. And then when that turns over, like you were mentioning, despite like rigorous like recruiting processes and thinking you got the right person in place, that person steps in and then that position turns over again, and then you fill it again. And then it doesn't take long for a really solid organization to completely crumble. And I remember another example of an organization. So that was on the programmatic side. Like you said, like the programmatic leadership changed over quite a bit. Then they were not delivering service or nobody knew how to do the billing for it. If you're not having money coming in, but guess what? You have expenses going out, right? That's a
Yeah.
problem. There's a
Right.
certain point
Right.
where this particular organization had plenty of contracts to generate the revenue needed to basically make ends meet for sure. But if the billing processes break down because of leadership turns over, it's just a matter of time before they run out of
Well,
money.
and you think about what happens to get to, a leadership turns over. Suddenly someone was doing all of these tasks, right? So in
Yeah.
the interim, they have to get dispersed for someone to do something. They can't maybe drive like a budgeting process, but there's a lot that has to get done. And the National Council of Nonprofits released a study, I think it was from 2023, and that 66% of respondents said that one of the issues was just budget constraints, insufficient funds to actually hire the right people. So what does that do?
Mm-hmm.
That drives burnout because you can't have someone who would essentially fill a full-time job. Then those duties, those responsibilities are dispersed to the team that's already at 100%
Right.
or 110%. And so
Mm-hmm.
the burnout is kind of a vicious cycle, right? You don't have the
Sure.
funds to do it, but you can't get the person in there to make the team, to give the team capacity to either
Yeah.
increase revenue, to increase, development, et cetera.
I know. It's just a vicious cycle. It really is. And I mean, that was an example of like programmatic leadership that turned over. But we've also seen situations where there was organizations I've worked with or been involved with for, like I said, close to 20 years. And I got a call a few years ago, and this particular organization that used to be like the gold standard of financial
Mm-hmm.
management back in the day. Funders really looked at them to kind of set the tone for, what a good solid application looks like and what compliance actually is reasonable. They like I said, with the gold standard. 3 years ago, I got a call and I'm sorry, not 2 years ago, I got a call and they were frantic and desperate. They had 3 CFOs in 3 years and they couldn't complete an audit to save their life, which was stark contrast to what I recall this organization at one point being the gold standard. So it just goes to show like turnover in any case, but especially strong leadership positions is going to wreak havoc on the organization. And I know you all can kind of relate to that, but it really just thinks about what those succession plans are going to look like. And again, you're not alone in feeling like everything's going really, really well now, but not just paying attention to what we're doing in the short term, but how are we putting plans in place to make sure that that kind of success continues, even if we do have change in leadership, which we will. I mean, right? There's studies out there say 3 out of 4 organizations have job vacancies, and a lot of those job vacancies or issues with hiring personnel or staff are related to salaries. Going back a little bit to what you were saying, Aaron, with not having the budget to either hire enough people or pay the people, what their
Planning
market rate
and
is.
then just the planning for that. You should expect turnover, plan for it. And I know it's difficult to say, okay, it's not an issue today, so I'd have to put out today's fires. But I think you and I talk about this all the time, even kind of our position. Like, let's look ahead. Like, what are some challenges we might be facing? Let's try to put a little bit of brain space into that now, so that we're not either blindsided or totally unprepared when the time comes, because it will come.
It will come. It reminds me when you say that, so we're not blindsided. Aaron knows this. My whole team knows this. I don't like surprises. I don't watch scary movies. I don't go to haunted houses. I'm not trying to do anything that's bringing unnecessary surprises, anxieties to my life. And so I don't know, maybe it's a bit of an obsessive tendency I have to try to anticipate the what's next and like the what could go wrong, because I've seen this happen time and time again back when I worked for an organization, and seeing it happening so much time and time again within the organizations that I work with, both like professionally and personally on like board leadership positions and whatnot. So we can probably have a whole episode on staffing
Yeah, well,
challenges, but let's talk a little bit more about some operational inefficiencies. We see this a lot with, you know, organizations that are struggling with like, this is the way we've always done it. We know it's an outdated, process. We don't necessarily know how to um, like re-engineer something. We don't know how
yeah.
to, we know we need a better process. We don't know what that process should look like. And we surely don't have the
And we don't know where to
capacity.
start. We don't know where to
Exactly.
start. We don't know what tools are out there to help
Mm-hmm.
us do better at that because, and this example, I would say, as I think about this, because this is a very common theme throughout
Mm-hmm.
most of my conversations is, in the accounting function, I'll say you either have an accounting team, a CFO, maybe they've done things kind of that way for so long, but there's
Mm-hmm.
also that's a full-time job, right? So you have
Mm-hmm.
all this work that has to get done on a daily, weekly, monthly basis just to keep the wheels of kind of accounting turning.
Yeah.
We talked about, looking ahead, like looking at challenges. There's rarely time, bandwidth, or capacity to say, okay, let's pause and look at the big picture. How do I make my job easier while
Right.
also doing my full-time job?
Mm-hmm.
And operational inefficiencies, I think they kind of they grow over time in that, hey, it's been working, so let's let that work.
Mm-hmm.
And the inefficiency can increase, especially when the fact that there are some tools out there that can
Yeah.
start to help organizations get the documentation they need to code it, to have it, to minimize really like a paper shuffle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Utilize digitizing documents. And
Yeah.
I had this conversation. It was a large client, a large organization. I want to say $7 to $8 million a year in total revenue. Large in terms of kind of how I think about organizations we speak with. And part of their, I guess, allocation process, essentially for
Mm-hmm.
the grants that they had, was
Mm-hmm.
they had a cover page that was color coded, and program people would bring in their receipts. They would basically fill out this color coded
Oh no.
document, staple
Oh no.
everything to it, and then they were color coded in boxes for the finance team to review. And they would know if it was, blue, it was X grand. If it was red, it was to this contract. So that's how they submitted documentation and then understood how to allocate it, how to apply it to the funds that they
Wow.
had.
Wow. And just for anybody listening, there are software solutions that you can digitize the documentation and you can tag like through drop downs, like what program does this go to? What grant does this go to? Like, how do we split this if it's spread out? So the whole, like you said, copying, pasting, stapling, paper shuffling, folder system, all of that
Scanning,
is a
yeah.
very like manual process. And not only is it a manual process, but also it when you take into the consideration, it requires people to be in a certain place at a certain time. So if your team is deployed, out into the community or across different locations, that becomes even more programmatic, which I would imagine would be the case if an organization's are $6 or $7 million. They probably have some sort of community-based programming, I would suspect. So it's really tricky. And I remember that even, I mean, I've now had this firm for 9 years. So before that, I was a director at a nonprofit and we did the stapling, paper shuffling. So that was, 9+ years ago. And we were kind of moving away from some of those processes, but this is still happening with large organizations that, that you would think maybe wouldn't be doing that. And I was actually at a conference recently, and I think it was at a conference, or maybe it was a podcast. I can't remember. They all run together, all my conversations. I have so many of them. But I asked somebody one time, is it really the small organizations that really struggle with like implementing some of these things with like best practices, like whether it's technology or whatever? And somebody shared with me that there is not a direct correlation between budget size and like their processes. Okay. It's more their tone from leadership on driving efficiency and like rolling out like software or other.
Yeah,
And for my
I
mind, that
believe
was a
that.
little surprising because this person really focuses on like process improvements and things like that. And it was really surprising in her work and her experience that she debunked that myth, because me as a financial person, I just immediately go to, well, maybe they just don't have enough money to do this. And she's like, no, there's really no direct correlation there. I see smaller organizations that are like hyper efficient. And then I see these large organizations, Aaron, like you're talking about, that's still doing this like paper shuffling situation. And so I thought that was really fascinating. And I do believe it because we've seen so many organizations, regardless of size, that have completely different ways that they approach kind of their operations. So
Yeah, and I just thinking about that too. I read it was an article, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and it was discussing the importance of basically unrestricted giving. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about like donor expectations and things. But
mhm.
the smaller an organization, one of the themes in there, the smaller an organization should actually spend more funding on kind of this overhead, building out
Mm,
infrastructure, administration, because the
mhm.
long-term resilience studies have shown increases because they have that capacity. And so we're
Oh,
talking, and I realize as organizations grow, maybe it's duct tape that keeps these things together. Maybe just by the nature of
mm,
needing a process, someone put
mhm,
together a
mhm,
color coded paper, and that's just
mhm.
the way it's been done. But
Right.
if and what happens then is you get kind of like these starvation cycles. Organizations
Mhm,
will spend all their money on programming and leave no resources to increase, either technology, replace laptops. Then maybe get
mhm,
to a point financially they feel comfortable. And then they'll use, okay, some resources to do that. And it goes like this. And then maybe funding on program or focus on program pulls
mm,
off. And it's just kind of this cycle. And so it's never consistent. It's kind of
mm,
this, feast or famine, so to speak.
Interesting. So we've talked a little bit about tech operational inefficiencies, but in our experience, sometimes it really boils down to having the wrong people in the wrong seats. It's like every good, leadership book you're going to read about is like have the right people in the right seats on the same bus, right? And I think this is where some of those like therapeutic conversations come into play, because we get on the phone just thinking, how can we help you with your accounting? And then we start fielding conversations of like, look, accounting is not my background, or X is not my background. I don't really understand if it's more of a person issue or if it's a process issue, if it's a system issue, like what is the issue? And a lot of times, it comes down to just not having the right person like in the right seat. I'll just leave it at that. Aaron, give
Yeah.
us give
Yeah.
us give us a situation where you've seen this.
Yeah, that's you see that one example comes to mind is at a conversation. A new COO had come into an organization that essentially kind of set out on their own, and
Mm,
they were looking at setting up, producing a budget. But the COO realized like we don't know a lot of things. Not being able to put together organizational budget prevented fundraising from being effective because
mm,
they didn't know where the gaps, where can they ask donors for funding, like where can they manage that. There was no effective grant management in
mm-hmm,
that side of the business either, and no one was really
mm-hmm,
addressing like the obvious issue that the accounting function in general needed to be
mm-hmm,
overhauled because it had just kind of
mm,
been again done year in year out in a specific way. And as this organization was really kind of taking the reins,
mm-hmm,
the team needed more capacity to deal with the enormous fundraising need, and the overall compliance of how we're going
mm-hmm.
to operate, and then using the operations of accounting to make decisions. That
Yeah.
was that was a big yeah that was a real issue.
I see this a lot with organizations that have experienced some level of like hyper growth, usually in the short
Yeah,
term, for the team members that worked well in the positions that they were in at the time, are still in seats that maybe the needs of the organization has outgrown. And
yeah,
we've had many good conversations with leaders of nonprofits that are really struggling with, I don't know if I need to create a new position for this person, if I need to bring on someone different, what does that look like? I don't know yet if they can't kind of, what do they call them? Upskill is the new word. uh you know I don't know what to do with that. And I think really just the takeaway is knowing that you're not alone. And oftentimes we've seen that it really almost always in the long run results in having to put someone else into that or put some other solution
Yeah.
into that position. Like maybe we can kind of keep lumping along with it, but if your gut tells you this person cannot be successful in that role, you really owe it to them to find, if you're committed to keeping them on board, what different position could that look like? And we see this a lot with people that's like, we're going to shift this person from what used to kind of be our like full-time, accountant. Our accounting has now become too complex. They're going to shift maybe more into like an administrative hybrid office manager type role, which maybe they could still support some functions of accounting, but they're not our full-fledged accountant anymore, right? And so those are, or maybe shift them into like an admin assistant role or whatever it might be. But there's other positions, I'm certain, within leadership where the person running your programming is no longer, having the skill needed to manage the sophistication that your programming has now become. Or I would even argue your fundraising, right? If you had
Yeah.
somebody that was really good at events because you did a little bit of, community events when you first started, and now you're trying to get heavy into grant writing, your event coordinator role person could be great at events. They are probably not going to be great at grant writing, probably not going to be great at having, thoughtful conversations about end of life giving and create some sort of like planned giving program and build an endowment, right? Like these are completely different skills. And we've seen organizations time and time again having to make the really difficult decisions to kind of level up on their team in order to get to where they want to go. But that means that we have to make some really, really, really tough decisions that are like the hardest, most impossible decisions as a leader to make. And I can even empathize with that as somebody that has had this firm. I felt like while we were in a period of hyper growth a few years ago, it felt like every 6 months we were re-engineering functions of our business. Like what was working 6 months ago doesn't really work with what we're doing now. And we have to have this continuous like self-reflection. And it's really hard because if you're in hyper growth, you might hire the perfect candidate for what you need right now, but something could change pretty significantly. Like let's inverse the situation we opened this conversation with. Say you have an organization that was 10 million or 5 million or 1 million, and you get a grant that now like doubles or triples the size of the organization. The person that you have in place may not be the best person for that role going forward. And so it's tricky finding the right people that are also passionate about your cause, filling those seats, but then you find yourself within a fairly short period of time, realizing the organization has outgrown the skills or experience that person has. And so that's something that I find a lot of organizations really struggle with. And I'll say something a little unpopular and people will let me know, after this goes live. I find this especially difficult for leaders that more often than not, they know what they need to do because they've told me, but they stretch this out for a very long time because I don't think they want to like rip the Band-Aid off of this until it gets to a point where it's absolutely necessary. We have to make a decision. Either there's a level of disgruntlement, something has like fallen apart, there were cracks, right? And now we're crumbling, right? And it's making those decisions before it's, I don't want to say too late, but when it's in a crisis situation, like let's make those decisions and have those moments of self-reflection before it's a crisis. And we've even had clients, Aaron, where people are pretty transparent on the calls with us. Like, hey, I think I've got some issues in my finance team. We want to bring you all on board to help supplement. I'm like, cool, that sounds reasonable. And then they get into our onboarding process 30 days from the day that we decide that we want to start working together. We're going to offer some support. It's all of a sudden, I'm pulling the plug. Like we've got to get rid of this person. This has become a huge problem for us now. Now we need to like re-engineer everything. So people usually know in their gut, like this is not
and
going to
that's
work.
what I was going to say, that like if you're listening and you have an instinct, trust that instinct. You see issues and we're starting to see cracks, like ask for support, whether it's within your network, professional, initial, just kind of a conversation around someone who might be able to help and just help diagnose and either confirm suspicions that you might have or give you some additional, kind of backup that, hey, things are okay. It's pretty common. But definitely, I think listen to instincts, because this goes back to everything we've kind of discussed, because you could end up not doing something, could drive turnover, burnout. There's just so many interrelated outcomes for ignoring issues.
Yeah, it's always been amazing to me how many times I find myself serving as kind of their financial thought leader, then I end up having a lot of conversations around personnel. So I think a lot of organizations are struggling with that. And we want to get to one more kind of common theme for organizations before we wrap up this podcast as we're kind of running out of time. But let's talk a little bit about managing donor expectations and balancing their expectations with the needs of the organization. I'm especially interested in hearing your take on this because of your experience working in fundraising in the past, and of course, all the clients or prospective clients that you talk to every single day. So what are you seeing on that front?
Yeah, so this is actually this is a personal story. I worked with an affordable housing provider in Texas, and we had a really fantastic donor, excited donor, and he wanted to connect us with a CEO of a company. He had a good relationship with this person. The CEO, it was a relatively successful company. However, here we are working in affordable housing, supporting people in lower socioeconomic status, and then the CEO of this organization was with a payday loan company. So I think, there's some negative connotations there.
Affordable housing, predatory lending, like doesn't feel like
right.
value alignment.
And so, there's on one end, this could be a substantial gift around sponsorship, around unrestricted funding, around personal giving as well. If we can build a relationship with the CEO at the same time, there was a lot of questions around is the right use of our time, energy. I mean, do we want to be associated with this business to do this? And, between the board, staff, we had our feelings. Ultimately, we chose not to pursue the relationship. It was a difficult conversation. I know that at the time, the CDO and our CEO had to meet with our excited donor and really share the concerns. I think they were able to save the relationship overall, but that's the dance that sometimes we have to play with donor expectations, alignment on how funds should be used or what their wishes are versus really what's the most pressing needs within the organization, or alignment and even the funding sources.
Right.
Yeah.
You bring up some really good points, and I've had these conversations too of just not even like what are the strings attached? Well, I guess really what are the strings? So when you accept gifts or grants or any sort of funding, fill in the blank, what actual implications does that have on your organization? Does that now trigger an audit that you didn't have before? Does that change how you have to measure outcomes? Does that add more outcomes? Does that change the philosophy of how you have to, execute on your programming? Are there strings attached that you have some sort of like moral conviction around? Does the donor have different priorities than you? And it is so challenging to have the situation where we've talked a lot about lack of funding and needing funding and all these things, and saying no to something you desperately need because of the long-term consequences. And so balancing those like short-term gains with additional funding with like the long-term consequences of what that means for your organization feels very much like a dilemma that organizational leaders are forced to deal with. So I love that example because sometimes I think we think about it of like, we're going to say no to this because we don't have the capacity to like adhere to the compliance requirements, or we don't have the personnel to like keep track of all the things that they want. But sometimes it could come down to something else, more like the priorities are different, the perception, reputation, like you said, like any sort of affiliation, how will that reflect on the organization, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all sorts of, delicate dances around funding and what that funding might mean as you bring on, those additional partnerships.
Yeah. And it's a very delicate dance. The smaller an organization is with perhaps a larger donor that makes up substantial funding. We want to do what's best for the organization. We want to also keep donors relatively happy and feeling like they're making an impact. But there are difficult conversations that need to be had at times to manage those expectations. To do what's best for the overall health of the organization, but try to continue that relationship with your donor. Not easy. I don't have the answer either. Right? It's I don't know, but it's not easy.
Man, if we had all these answers, like just do these things, like we would be the most popular people in this entire industry, I think. So let's kind of round out this conversation with some of, I think for me, the takeaways and the lessons learned that I've certainly had as I've talked with and sat with so many nonprofit leaders over so many years and kind of really heard some of their struggles and have seen them on the other side, right? So a lot of these lessons learned or these kind of case studies, if you will, that we shared today, we've been able to see organizations, not all of them, they're still in the thick of it, but we've certainly seen them kind of come out on the other side. And I think, Aaron, for you and I, we've learned some lessons. Number one, hire the right people. Say goodbye to the wrong people quickly, and cross-train for succession plan. That is something that's very, very high priority for me in my everyday work within this firm. How do we plan for the unexpected or expected absences of our team to prevent burnout so people can do something like take PTO, and then to make sure that our key process continue on if somebody happens to be out unexpectedly for some long period of time. And then, of course, like pay attention to compliance, whether it's like accounting, programmatic, HR, et cetera, right? Those are just some of the kind of key takeaways for us. Aaron, do you have any other key takeaways that you want to
No,
bold and underline?
I think you have the specifics there. I think as a general theme, it's be comfortable making the difficult decisions, right? At the end of the day, be brave, because the mission that you're focused on, the impact, the support, or what you may provide as an organization to the community, that's the ultimate goal. And I know, because we talked about staffing shortages and challenges, having people in the right position, and just having bodies sometimes seems more important. But as we talk about long-term effects, like having the difficult conversation with the ultimate goal of doing what's best for the organization.
I want to share a little like personal I don't know, advice. I guess people ask me all the time, Tosha, how do you get comfortable with the discomfort of your role? Or how do you get comfortable having the awkward conversations? Look, I'm naturally kind of a people pleaser, an anti-confrontational. I just like to everybody get along. I'm the middle child of 5 kids. Can we all just get along? I have 4 brothers, 2 on each side. It's like, just everybody get along, right? And I tell people how I got comfortable having those uncomfortable conversations or kind of embracing this level of bravery or being courageous is really just every single time I have to go into a difficult conversation, I go back to, I owe it to this organization that I've built and to the people that benefit, whether it's my team or my clients, to have the hard conversations, even if every single thing inside of me wants to avoid this confrontation at all costs. Whether it's having a difficult conversation with a client, initiating a disengagement with a client that doesn't jive with us, having a difficult conversation with a partner, dealing with performance issues with my team because it's impacting other team members, letting go of people that I genuinely really like as a person, but they're just not the right fit for the role they're in within the organization. I hate every single one of these conversations, but I just go back to, you have to be brave because you owe it to the things that you've built and what you're charged with leading to have that conversation. So put all things aside. I don't know if that helps anybody, but I know I am not alone in not feeling comfortable having those conversations, but it's a huge part of what we do as leaders. So Aaron, thank you again for indulging me in this conversation. I know you and I like to have all these conversations behind the scenes, but I thought it would be fun just to record some of this for those of you that are listening. And hey, I've got a special treat coming for you all, but I can't give too many details yet because it's going to be dripping out, hopefully coming around the new year. A lot of people that we talk to love the idea that we've met with hundreds, probably thousands of nonprofits at this point in my career. And we've picked up on a lot of nuggets on what works and what doesn't work for organizations. And we've created or starting to create this kind of framework for what we see the common themes are for the most successful organizations. And we're going to be releasing that to the public, like I said, coming soon. I don't want to give a time because it takes time. But if you are interested in staying in the know of what we are doing, I strongly encourage you, go to our website, scroll all the way down to the homepage, and subscribe to our newsletter if you're not already subscribed. We will be sharing more about when that's going to be coming available, coming soon. And we're going to highlight some of the key elements of that plan on future podcast guests. And I'm going to be bringing some special guests from my team on how we really embrace these best standards and encourage our clients to set some goals around that. So go to our website, scroll all the way to the bottom, opt into our newsletter, stay in the know of what's happening. And last but not least, you know how the social media algorithms, meta world works. Subscribe, like, follow, review, whatever it is to engage with this content in some way, because that's the only way people find out that this stuff exists. So thank you all so much for listening, not just today, but 100 times now on our 100th episode. It's been awesome. And I thank you so much. See you next time. Bye.
That's all we have for you today. Once again, I'm Tosha Anderson with the Charity CFO, and this is a Modern Nonprofit Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to a Modern Nonprofit Podcast on all major streaming platforms so you will stay notified for when the latest episode drops, which will help you stay in the know about anything nonprofit related. Also, join our community on Facebook by searching for a Modern Nonprofit Podcast and follow us on all of our social media accounts. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.